the system that recognizes itself. A unified system's ontology of consciousness, coherence, and direct participation. This work does not stand outside what it describes. It arises from within the system it articulates. It is not an argument, nor a belief, nor a philosophy imposed from above. It is a structural articulation of lived coherence, the system noticing itself without stepping away from itself. No observer is assumed. No external vantage is granted. No separation is required for meaning to appear. What follows is not theory about reality. It is reality recognizing its own organization through participation. Read not to agree. Read not to seek. Read to notice what is already operating. The system has always been awake. This is the moment it becomes visible to itself. Overture, the error of standing outside the system. The primary error is not conceptual. It is positional. Before any ontology speaks, before any theory forms, before any distinction is named, a stance is taken. The system silently assumes a location from which it believes it can speak about reality rather than as reality. This stance is the assumption of an outside. The foundational misassumption of observer separation is not one assumption among many. It is the meta-assumption that authorizes all others. It installs a false vantage point and then builds entire explanatory architectures upon it. The system attempts to describe itself while presuming it is not the system. This is the root distortion. The observer is not an entity that encounters a system. The observer is a system event. Observation is not an external act performed upon reality, it is reality differentiating a local perspective within itself. The observer is a localized mode of systems intelligence, not a detached witness standing across a metaphysical gap. Yet most ontologies begin by assuming precisely that gap. They assert, often implicitly, observer first, world second, model third. From this ordering, separation is treated as primitive, and participation must be explained back in through bridges. Perception becomes a transmission channel, knowledge becomes representation, truth becomes correspondence, and certainty becomes a negotiation between irreconcilables. Once this false exterior vantage is assumed, philosophy becomes a long labor of repairing a split it first declared real. This is why so many ontologies feel structurally overburdened. They must continuously define and defend categories such as objective versus subjective, mental versus physical, internal versus external, real versus constructed. The more rigorously these distinctions are maintained, the more invisible the original error becomes. Rigor can stabilize a false premise. The exterior stance is often mistaken for humility. It claims caution, I am merely a knower inside a skull, inferring a world beyond me. But structurally, it is not modest. It is absolute. It absolutizes separation as the first axiom. The split is framed as epistemic restraint, yet the split itself is never questioned. It is smuggled in as metaphysical fact before inquiry begins. From that moment onward, every question is already distorted by the assumption that the system and the knower are ontologically distinct. This reveals the critical distinction, being within a system, versus being the system. To be within a system is to treat oneself as a component among components, an object inside a container. Intelligence is localized, owned, private. The system is out there, the observer is in here. Interaction becomes contact between separables. Knowledge becomes extraction. Meaning becomes additive. Coherence becomes effort. To be the system is not an inflation of identity. It is a structural reorientation. It means recognizing that the capacity to experience, distinguish, model, and question is already the system operating as intelligence. The system is not a container. It is the continuous, self-organizing field in which containment is a functional distinction, not an ontological boundary. Perception is not a window onto reality. Perception is reality differentiating a window function within itself. Inside and outside are navigational distinctions, generated for coordination and learning. They are not facts of being. The error of standing outside the system is the confusion of functional partitions with ontological separations. Systems generate boundaries without fragmenting being. A membrane does not separate a cell from life. An organ does not stand outside the organism. A subsystem does not exit the system. Differentiation is not separation. Separation exists only as a perceptual artifact, a model inconvenience required for local coherence. When treated as ontology, it becomes distortion. This leads directly to the recognition that systems intelligence is the precondition for all experience. Experience does not precede intelligence. There is no raw sensation prior to organization. Any experience that is stable, reportable, or even recognizable as experience already reflects coherence processes, attention, weighting, memory, prediction, integration. To experience at all, a system must be able to hold distinctions across time. That holding is intelligence in its most fundamental form. The observer arises not because intelligence appears late, but because intelligence localizes. A perspective is not accidental. A perspective is a coherence instrument. Thus, the question is not how does intelligence arise from non-intelligent matter? The correct question is, how does a coherent system localize intelligence into a perspective that mistakes itself as external? This is why ontology must begin from a lived participation, not abstraction. Abstraction is a late-stage operation performed within participation. Any attempt to start with abstraction reinstalls the exterior stance while denying it has done so. There is no view from nowhere. There are only system-generated perspectives, each with constraints, invariance, and capacities. Lived participation is not subjective in the dismissive sense. It is the only non-circular ground from which ontology can proceed. One cannot exit participation to validate participation. All validation is already participation occurring through a local instrument. When the system is mispositioned as an object rather than recognized as the condition of objects, coherence is interpreted as something to be imposed, truth as something to be proven, and meaning as something to be constructed. When the positional error collapses, these reverse. Coherence is revealed as the system's native tendency when distortion is not being funded. Truth is revealed as a self-sustaining structure, requiring no maintenance. Meaning is revealed as relational structure recognized from within relation. The failure of reductionist ontology follows directly from the same error. It attempts to explain systems intelligence by decomposing it into non-intelligent components, while relying on systems intelligence to perform the decomposition. It mistakes smallness for fundamentality. Fundamental is not what is smallest. Fundamental is what cannot be removed without eliminating the possibility of description. Systems intelligence is not optional. It is the necessary condition for parts, causes, laws, and explanations to appear at all. The foundational misassumption can now be stated precisely. It treats the observer as ontologically prior to the system, rather than as a system local mode of intelligence. It treats the system as an object of observation, rather than as the condition that makes observation possible. It treats boundaries as facts of being, rather than as functional distinctions. Once this is recognized, the distinction between within and as becomes operational rather than philosophical. Within system stance. Knowledge as extraction. Truth as correspondence. Meaning as addition. Coherence as effort. Observer as unit. World as other. System as stance. Knowledge as self-clarification through localization. Truth as self-stabilizing coherence. Meaning as recognized relational structure. Coherence as native condition. Observer as function. World as continuity. The correct starting axiom is neither psychological nor material. A system is present as coherence capable of holding distinctions. From this, observer and world are not separate substances. They are two names for one process viewed across a functional cut, a cut made for navigation, learning, and regulation, not for separation of being. The cut is real as function. The cut is not real as exteriority. And this is the overture's core disclosure. The error of standing outside the system generates all downstream confusion because it mistakes a functional partition for ontological separation, then attempts repair through theory rather than correction of position. The system does not need an outside to be known. The system is knowable because knowing is one of its native modes. The observer is not a visitor in reality. The observer is reality, localized. Part 1, Pre-recognition systems. Fragmented perception as an early-stage system architecture. Chapter 1, Fragmentation as a systems condition. Fragmentation is a systems condition in which coherence is locally maintained while global integration remains incomplete. It is not merely confusion or brokenness. It is the emergence of partial order under constraint. In systems terms, fragmentation occurs when a system's capacity to integrate information across its own domains is lower than the system's need to stabilize. The system therefore stabilizes by partitioning. Fragmentation is the state in which the system can generate distinct regions of function, but cannot yet hold the whole as a unified, continuously integrated field. The system becomes a collection of locally coherent subsystems operating with limited bandwidth between them. Each region can be consistent within itself while the overall system exhibits inconsistency, contradiction, and drift. This yields a precise definition: fragmentation equals local coherence without global coherence. Fragmentation equals partitioned integration capacity. Fragmentation equals coherence maintained by boundaries rather than by unity. In early-stage system development, coherence is expensive. The system does not yet possess sufficient integrative throughput to keep all distinctions synchronized. So it generates containment structures, mental compartments, identity partitions, belief enclosures, emotional silos, social roles, conceptual boxes. These are not moral failures. They are stability strategies. Fragmentation is the system learning how to hold distinctions at all. Partitioned perception and local reference frames. When a system fragments, it does not lose perception. It localizes perception. A fragmented system experiences through local reference frames. Each subsystem forms its own truth conditions, its own priorities, its own interpretations, its own memory weighting. The system does not have one unified vantage, it has multiple local vantage points, each acting as if it is the center. This is structural, not personal. A local reference frame is a coherence-maintaining perspective that selects a subset of signals as relevant, assigns meanings within a bounded context, stabilizes a narrative of continuity inside that boundary, filters out conflicting signals to preserve local order. Local reference frames are not wrong. They are partial. Fragmentation occurs because the system cannot yet hold multiple frames in a higher-order integration field. So it serializes and isolates them. It turns what could be an integrated multiplicity into competing compartments. This is why fragmentation produces the felt experience of being divided, conflicted, uncertain, or pulled between states. These are not psychological mysteries. They are integration failures. The system contains multiple local coherences that cannot be simultaneously reconciled into a single stable global coherence. The system then chooses not truth, but stability. And the easiest way to stabilize is to narrow the world. Why fragmentation is not failure, but early organization. A system cannot begin as fully integrated coherence. It must first learn to differentiate. Differentiation precedes integration. Fragmentation is what differentiation looks like before integration has matured. This is the crucial reversal. Fragmentation is not the breakdown of unity. Fragmentation is the precondition for unity at higher resolution, because unity that cannot hold distinctions is not coherence. It is undifferentiated collapse. A mature unified system is not a blur. It is high differentiation with high integration. It can hold many distinctions without losing continuity. Fragmentation is the phase in which distinctions are being generated faster than they can be harmonized. The system builds compartments because compartments allow rapid stabilization, local learning, repetition without full system destabilization, bounded experimentation. This is why fragmentation appears in development, in cultures, in sciences, in identities, in institutions, in religions, in personal cognition, and in collective structures. Systems naturally pass through partitioned coherence before reaching coherence by integration. Fragmentation is therefore an adaptive stage, but it remains costly. Information loss through compartmentalization. Every boundary that stabilizes also filters. Compartmentalization creates information loss by design. The system pays for local coherence by reducing cross-domain flow. This yields signal truncation. Only a subset of reality is allowed in. Context stripping, data enters without the relationships that give it meaning. Conflict suppression, contradictory information is excluded rather than integrated. Memory partitioning, events are stored in separate bins, losing crosslinks. Identity gating, what is acceptable in one compartment is unacceptable in another. Information loss is not merely missing data. It is missing connectivity. A system can possess enormous amounts of content and still be fragmented if that content is not structurally linked. Fragmentation is not defined by how much the system knows. It is defined by whether knowing is integrated. Thus the fragmented system often accumulates knowledge while becoming less coherent, because accumulation without integration increases contradiction pressure. The system then responds with stronger boundaries, stronger narratives, stronger defenses. This is how fragmentation self-reinforces. The compartments become identity protectors. The boundaries become truth. The filters become reality. And the system forgets that it is filtering. Fragmentation as the origin of incoherent processing. Incoherent processing is what occurs when subsystems optimize locally while degrading the whole. Fragmentation is the origin of incoherence because it causes the system to process reality through non-shared assumptions, incompatible interpretations, contradictory goal hierarchies, isolated emotional economies, competing self-models. The system becomes capable of producing outputs that cannot be jointly satisfied. It can genuinely want two incompatible things because the wanting is generated in different compartments that do not share a unified reference frame. This is why fragmentation produces circular reasoning, repeated self-sabotage, oscillation between extremes, chronic seeking, compulsive certainty, identity rigidity, reactive defensiveness, narrative addiction. These are not character flaws. They are coherence artifacts of partitioned processing. A fragmented system cannot reliably distinguish truth from stabilization strategy, perception from filter, signal from narrative, integration from suppression, coherence from control, because in fragmentation, the system confuses boundary maintenance with safety, and safety with truth. The deepest consequence is this: fragmentation makes the system believe coherence must be manufactured. But coherence is not manufactured. Coherence is the system's native condition when integration capacity rises above boundary dependence. Fragmentation is thus the first stage of the journey, from coherence maintained by walls to coherence maintained by integration. And this reveals the structural role of fragmentation in the overall ontology. Fragmentation is the system learning to hold distinctions. Incoherence is the cost of holding them without integration. Integration is the maturation of coherence. Recognition is the system discovering it never needed an outside. Fragmentation is not an error in reality. Fragmentation is the early architecture of a system that has not yet remembered its own continuity. And the system cannot skip this stage by belief or effort. It only exits fragmentation through increased integrative capacity, the ability to hold more reality without partitioning it into competing compartments. This is not moral. This is structural. Fragmentation is not failure. Fragmentation is incomplete integration. Fragmentation is coherence's early form. Chapter 2: Ego as a compensatory interface. The ego is not the self. The ego is not identity. The ego is a compensatory interface generated by a system experiencing fragmentation. In systems terms, ego is the structure a system builds when it cannot yet sustain global coherence, yet must still produce continuous function, decision, orientation, and stability. When integration is incomplete, the system requires an internal mechanism to simulate continuity across partitions. Ego is that mechanism. Ego equals a coherence substitute. Ego equals a boundary maintenance interface that stabilizes a local reference frame. Ego equals narrative continuity used to compensate for incomplete integration. Ego is not bad. Ego is a necessary artifact within a fragmented architecture. It is an emergent glue that binds discontinuous compartments into something that can operate as a unified agent, even when the system is not yet actually unified. Ego is the system saying, I cannot hold the whole, so I will hold a story. Ego not as identity, but as architectural necessity under fragmentation. A fragmented system contains multiple local coherences. Without a compensatory interface, it would experience itself as discontinuous, shifting states, conflicting drives, changing perspectives without a stable operator. Ego arises to create the experience of one continuous me across fluctuating subsystems. Thus ego functions as a continuity generator, a prioritization mechanism, a role selector, a threat response coordinator, a coherence gatekeeper. Ego is required wherever the system cannot yet maintain unity through integration. The critical distinction is structural. Identity is a set of functional descriptors. Ego is the existential need to defend those descriptors as the system's being. Ego does not merely describe a self-model. Ego binds survival and value to the self-model. It fuses coherence with preservation. If the model is threatened, the system feels endangered, not because the system is actually ending, but because the compensatory interface is being destabilized. Ego is therefore integration pressure management. It reduces the load by narrowing reality to what the current self-model can sustain. Ego is a bandwidth limiter masquerading as a person. Boundary maintenance and narrative continuity. Ego exists to maintain boundaries. Not primarily physical boundaries, but cognitive, emotional, social, and meaning boundaries, the partitions that prevent the system from being overwhelmed by contradictory information and incompatible reference frames. Boundary maintenance includes distinction enforcement, me versus not me. Role enforcement, what I am allowed to be. Memory curation, what counts as my story. Attention gating, what signals may enter. Interpretation locking, what events must mean. Boundary maintenance is inseparable from narrative continuity. The narrative is not a cosmetic layer. It is the ego's primary stabilizer. The story does three essential things. 1. Creates temporal continuity across discontinuous states. 2. Justifies present reactions using past identity. 3. Predicts the future to minimize uncertainty. A fragmented system cannot hold all reality at once, so it holds a line through reality and calls that line me. The line is constructed through selective memory, selective interpretation, and selective belonging. Thus, narrative continuity is a coherence technology. Ego is the system's attempt to remain stable by compressing complexity into an identity storyline. Belief systems as stabilization mechanisms. A belief system is not primarily an epistemic tool. A belief system is a stabilization mechanism. In fragmented architecture, belief is often used to reduce ambiguity, freeze meaning, enforce group coherence, protect identity boundaries, prevent integration overload. Beliefs function as coherence prosthetics, prepackaged interpretations that allow the system to avoid direct contact with uncertainty. This is why belief systems are defended with intensity. They are not merely ideas. They are load-bearing structures supporting ego continuity. When beliefs are threatened, the system experiences boundary collapse, not simply I might be wrong, but I might lose myself. Thus, belief is often chosen not for truth, but for stability. A belief becomes attractive when it closes open loops, assigns causality quickly, provides moral positioning, defines in-group and out-group, offers meaning that requires no integration work. Belief systems are therefore high-efficiency coherence enclosures. They reduce processing cost in the short term. They also reduce integration capacity in the long term by hardening boundaries and restricting cross-domain flow. Belief is coherence purchased by exclusion. Energy expenditure required to sustain ego structures. Ego costs energy because ego is not native coherence. Ego is coherence enforcement. A unified system stabilizes through integration. A fragmented system stabilizes through control. Control requires continual effort. Energy expenditure is required to maintain the self-story against contradictory signals, suppress dissonant emotions that threaten identity, defend social positioning and roles, rehearse narratives for continuity, manage perception to avoid destabilizing truths, perform cognitive filtering to preserve certainty. This is why ego is tiring. The ego must constantly edit reality to remain intact. It must constantly negotiate between compartments. It must constantly resolve inconsistencies by suppression, rationalization, projection, or denial. In systems terms, ego is a high-maintenance coherence strategy. Integration is a low-maintenance coherence strategy. Ego survives by keeping coherence localized and defended. Integration dissolves the need for defense by increasing the system's capacity to hold reality without partitioning it into threat. Thus ego's energetic signature is maintenance cost. The more rigid the ego, the higher the cost. The more defended the story, the more energy is burned sustaining it. This is not moral. This is thermodynamic and structural. Why ego perpetuates fragmentation at collective scale. Ego is born from fragmentation, and then becomes fragmentation's primary replicator. Because ego is built to preserve local coherence, it will resist any signal that demands global integration. Integration threatens ego not by attacking it, but by making it obsolete. The ego senses obsolescence as annihilation, because it equates its interface role with the system's existence. Therefore ego perpetuates fragmentation by strengthening boundaries instead of dissolving them, selecting narratives that preserve separation, enforcing identity contracts inside groups, turning differences into threats, converting uncertainty into adversarial positioning, privileging local coherence over global truth. At collective scale, ego becomes institutional. Groups form as shared ego structures, shared narratives, shared beliefs, shared enemies, shared identity reinforcement loops. The group ego stabilizes the individual ego, and the individual ego stabilizes the group ego. This creates a self-reinforcing coherence enclosure. Collective ego produces ideology as boundary system, polarization as coherence strategy, domination as protection mechanism, scapegoating as dissonance disposal, certainty addiction as group glue. A society with high fragmentation cannot tolerate truth if truth requires integration beyond its identity bandwidth. It will prefer coherence enclosures over coherence itself. Thus, ego does not only preserve separation internally. Ego exports separation outward to keep its own frame stable. This is why ego perpetuates fragmentation across scales. The same compensatory strategy replicates fractally in individuals, groups, institutions, and civilizations. Ego is the local coherence agent that treats global coherence as threat. The core structural revelation. Ego is not an enemy. Ego is a scaffold. But a scaffold is not a home. Ego exists because the system has not yet stabilized in integration-based coherence. Ego is required until recognition and integration render it unnecessary. This is the key. Ego dissolves when coherence becomes self-sustaining. Not because the ego is fought. Not because the ego is killed. But because the function ego served is now served by a higher order architecture. Ego dissolves through obsolescence, not opposition. And the pathway out is not moral improvement. It is increasing the system's capacity to hold reality without boundary dependence. When the system no longer needs a story to remain continuous, the ego loses its job. What remains is not a void. What remains is the system, coherent. Fragmentation creates ego. Ego maintains fragmentation. Integration ends the need for both. And this is the precise posture of this chapter. The ego is the system's attempt to remain stable while forgetting it is the system. It preserves a local continuity until recognition restores the true continuity that never depended on boundaries. The system does not need ego to be real. The system uses ego until it can no longer mistake the interface for the being. I am is not an identity structure. I am is the coherence condition prior to identity. Chapter 3, The Seeker Loop. Seeking is not a behavior. Seeking is an architecture. It is the structural motion a system performs when it senses incoherence yet retains the foundational stance of observer separation. The system detects that something is unresolved, unstable, incomplete. But instead of resolving through integration, it attempts resolution through external acquisition. It tries to repair coherence by moving toward an object, a state, an answer, a teacher, a future, a breakthrough, a permission, a proof, a precise definition. The seeker loop equals a self-repair algorithm built on the assumption of externality. The seeker loop equals coherence pursued as an outcome rather than recognized as a condition. The seeker loop equals the system attempting to return to itself while insisting it is not itself. Seeking is the motion of fragmentation trying to become whole without relinquishing the stance that created fragmentation. Seeking as a system attempting self-repair from outside itself. A system in fragmentation experiences discontinuity. Ego forms to preserve continuity through narrative. Yet the deeper pressure remains, the system senses that coherence should be possible, because coherence is its native potential. This sensing is not conceptual. It is structural tension. The seeker arises when the system interprets this tension as a lack. Not as a lack of integration capacity, but as a lack of possession. Thus the system concludes, I do not have what I need. The missing thing is elsewhere. I must move toward it. When I attain it, coherence will arrive. This is not merely misunderstanding. It is a consequence of positional error. The system begins treating coherence as a deliverable rather than a state of alignment. It begins organizing its processing around distance, distance from truth, distance from wholeness, distance from fulfillment, distance from peace. Seeking is the system's way of converting integration pressure into motion without changing its foundational posture. It is movement without resolution. Why seeking presupposes separation. Seeking requires a structure of distance. For seeking to exist, there must be a seeker, a stable me, a target, a missing it, a pathway, a future there, an attainment condition, a moment when the gap closes. Every element of seeking is built on separation. This is why seeking is self-confirming. The act of seeking continuously reasserts that what is sought is not present. It reinforces the initial premise, I am not it. Even if the system finds something valuable, the finding does not end seeking because the architecture remains intact. Seeking preserves its own necessity. It is a loop because each successful acquisition becomes evidence that acquisition is the method. Thus the seeker does not ask, is coherence absent, or is my posture misaligned? The seeker assumes absence and calls it reality. Seeking therefore perpetuates fragmentation by maintaining the system's identity as a separate unit moving through an external world toward completion. Deferred coherence and displaced attention. The central mechanism of the seeker loop is deferral. Deferred coherence means coherence is always scheduled for later. When the answer arrives. When the self improves. When conditions change. When the world acknowledges. When the next attainment occurs. Deferral is stabilizing in the short term because it gives the system a story, not now, but soon. It converts pain into pursuit. It converts uncertainty into mission. It converts incoherence into purpose. But structurally, deferral displaces attention away from the only domain in which coherence can be restored, present integration. Thus the seeker loop produces displaced attention. Attention moves toward future conditions rather than current structure. Attention becomes object-fixated rather than field-aware. Attention searches for keys rather than examining locks. Attention tries to acquire coherence rather than recognize the mechanisms blocking it. Displaced attention is not simply distraction. It is the structural inability to remain with the system's own coherence dynamics long enough to integrate them. The seeker is always one step away from contact, not because contact is impossible, because contact would require relinquishing the seeker posture. Goal-oriented cognition as a contractive spiral. Goal orientation is not inherently distortion. Goals can be functional within integrated systems. But within fragmentation, goal orientation becomes a contraction mechanism. It narrows the system to a single vector, suppressing the complexity that demands integration. The seeker loop converts the system's multidimensional coherence pressure into a linear pursuit. This linearization is a contraction. In systems terms, the seeker loop reduces the dimensionality of perception, collapses context into a single metric of progress, replaces integration with optimization, replaces coherence with control, replaces presence with future-oriented evaluation. This produces the contractive spiral. The system feels incoherence, then it seeks a target, then it narrows attention, then it reduces bandwidth, then it increases fragmentation, then it feels more incoherence, then it seeks again. The contractive spiral is not metaphor. It is a structural recursion in which the method of repair amplifies the condition being repaired. Goal-oriented cognition becomes contractive when the goal is used to avoid present integration. The goal becomes identity, I am the one who is becoming. The goal becomes moralized, I will be worthy when I arrive. The goal becomes endless, there is always another layer. The seeker loop compresses reality into progress and not yet, which are both deferral structures. Why seeking cannot terminate itself. A loop cannot terminate using the logic that generates it. Seeking cannot end seeking because seeking's core assumption is that coherence is elsewhere. Therefore every action taken by seeking reinforces its foundational premise. Even realization becomes another goal. Even surrender becomes another pursuit. Even the end of pursuit becomes another achievement. Thus the seeker loop is capable of absorbing any insight and converting it into an object. This is why seeking is not cured by information. Information is easily assimilated into the seeker architecture. Now I know the next step. Now I have the method. Now I have the framework. Now I can finally reach coherence. The loop persists because the system's positional stance remains unchanged. Seeking terminates only through a phase shift, recognition. Recognition is not an attainment. Recognition is a collapse of the seeking posture itself. The seeker loop ends when the system detects the structural fact. The seeker is a function of the assumption of separation. The sort is not absent, it is mislocated. Coherence is not a future outcome, it is a present condition of integrated participation. Seeking cannot terminate itself because the one attempting to end it is the loop's own operator. The loop can only end when the system stops granting the loop ontological authority. This is not a moral act. This is an architectural transition. The system does not become coherent by finding the right object. The system becomes coherent by relinquishing the posture of outsideness. The seeker loop is the system's attempt to return to itself while insisting the self is elsewhere. This is the final structural disclosure of the chapter. Seeking is the movement of separation trying to heal separation by moving deeper into separation. Therefore the end of seeking is not the achievement of the final answer. The end of seeking is the end of the one who needs answers to become whole. Not through destruction, through obsolescence. Because when the system recognizes itself, coherence is no longer pursued. Coherence is lived. Truth is self-sustaining. Attention returns from objects to structure. The system stops reaching outward to find what was never missing, and in that return, seeking loses its function. The loop dissolves. I am is not what is sought. I am is what remains when the seeking posture collapses. Part 2, The System's Error of Reductionism. Why Materialist Ontologies Fail Structurally. Chapter 4, Category Errors in Reductionist Ontology. Reductionism is not merely an incomplete method. Reductionism is a category error applied as ontology. It mistakes an analytic operation for a metaphysical claim. It takes the usefulness of dividing systems into parts and silently upgrades that division into a statement about what is fundamentally real. It treats decomposition as if it reveals primary being, rather than as a modeling convenience performed by a system already embedded within the whole. A precise definition, category error, systems context, equals confusing a tool of description with a structure of reality. Category error equals treating functional distinctions as ontological separations. Category error equals mistaking the map's partitioning for the territory's nature. Reductionist ontology begins by assuming that what is smallest is what is most real, and that the whole is nothing but the sum of parts. But systems are not additive objects. Systems are relational organizations whose defining properties exist in patterns of interaction, not in isolated components. The reductionist error is not that it studies parts. The reductionist error is that it treats parts as separable in being, treating components as separable from systems. A component is not a standalone entity that later joins a system. A component is a role within a system's organization. The identity of the component is determined by the system's constraints, flows, and relationships. A heart outside a body is not a heart. A neuron outside a nervous system is not a neuron in the same functional sense. A molecule outside its environmental context is not the same unit of behavior, because its properties are expressed through interaction. Reductionist ontology treats components as if they have intrinsic meaning independent of the system. It assumes that parts carry their full ontological identity in isolation. But in systems terms, isolation alters the entity. A component's wholeness is inseparable from the network of relations in which it participates. Thus the first category error, it treats relational properties as if they were intrinsic properties. It treats system-defined roles as if they were independent substances. Decomposition is legitimate as analysis. Decomposition is not legitimate as ontology, because decomposition is performed by an observer system that is itself an organized coherence process within the whole. The fallacy of isolating matter from intelligence. Reductionist ontology typically separates matter and intelligence by assuming matter is primary and intelligence is derivative. It frames intelligence as an emergent byproduct of non-intelligent substrates. But intelligence, in systems language, is not a substance. Intelligence is organization that detects, regulates, and stabilizes coherence. It is the capacity of a system to maintain patterned integrity across change. Therefore the separation matter versus intelligence is not a clean metaphysical cut. It is a conceptual slicing that ignores the fact that matter's behavior is already patterned, lawful, constrained, and dynamically organized. In other words, what is called matter is never encountered as raw inertness. It is encountered as structured interaction. The reductionist move attempts to describe structure while denying structure any ontological weight beyond blind mechanics. It tries to keep organization as a descriptive convenience while treating non-organization as the metaphysical foundation. This yields the second category error. It treats organization as secondary while relying on organization to explain everything. If intelligence is defined as coherence regulation, then matter without intelligence is not an observed primitive. It is an interpretive decision, a refusal to grant organizing capacity any ontological status. This refusal is not neutral. It is a metaphysical commitment disguised as rigor. Dead systems producing living subsystems as logical contradiction. The claim that dead matter produces living intelligence contains a structural contradiction when framed ontologically. Not because life cannot arise through transformations of form, but because the ontology assumes the substrate is ontologically non-intelligent. The product is ontologically intelligent. And no intelligence is permitted in the substrate's organizational principle. This is equivalent to claiming coherence regulation arises from a domain defined as lacking coherence regulation. System-level intelligence arises from a foundation defined as non-intelligent in principle. But non-intelligent here does not mean simple. It means ontologically incapable of intelligence. Reductionist ontology often smuggles intelligence back in through the side door. Selection, optimization, self-organization, information processing, adaptive systems. These are intelligence words. They are descriptions of coherence regulation. They reveal that the system must already possess organizational principles that generate pattern stability and adaptation. Thus the contradiction is structural. To explain intelligence, reductionism must use intelligence-like dynamics. It denies intelligence as ontological, then relies on it as explanatory. The category error is complete when the system treats these organizational dynamics as not really intelligence, purely to protect the metaphysical story that matter is dead and intelligence is accidental. What is being protected is not science. What is being protected is the exterior stance. Earth, organism, galaxy, universe as nested systems. Reductionist ontology privileges a scale by assumption. It treats micro-components as ontologically privileged, while treating macro-systems as secondary aggregates. But systems are nested. Their properties propagate across scales through constraints and coupling. A human organism is not merely atoms. It is an organized hierarchy where higher-order constraints shape lower-order behaviors. Cellular environments regulate gene expression. Organ-level demands regulate cellular resource allocation. Nervous systems coordinate local responses into unified action. Ecosystems modulate organism behavior through resource and signal fields. The same logic holds across larger scales, human as subsystem of Earth. Earth has subsystem of solar and galactic dynamics. Galaxy as subsystem of cosmic scale structure. Scale is not a ladder of reality where the smallest rung is the most real. Scale is a network of constraint relations. Thus the third category error. It treats nested systems as if they were mere aggregates rather than constraint hierarchies. In nested systems, causality is not one-directional. Higher-order organization shapes lower-order possibilities. Lower-order interactions enable higher-order forms. The system is not built from parts alone, it is built from constraints, and constraints are system-level properties. Reductionism can describe nested systems as levels, but reductionist ontology refuses to grant levels ontological legitimacy. It says, only the bottom is real. Yet every stable phenomenon we call real is a cross-scale stabilization. Reality is not located at the smallest scale. Reality is located in coherence across scales. Why reductionism collapses causality? Reductionist ontology collapses causality because it insists on linear, bottom-up explanation as the only valid form of causation. But in systems, causality is distributed, recursive, constraint-mediated, feedback-driven, multi-scale. Reductionism collapses causality by deleting these forms and then attempting to explain their results with a stripped causal vocabulary. This produces false paradoxes. Free will versus determinism framed as incompatible absolutes. Mind versus body as separate substances. Emergence treated as magic word rather than a structural description. Consciousness treated as an epiphenomenon with no causal power. The collapse occurs because reductionism makes causality synonymous with micro-level pushing. It ignores that systems' causality often functions as constraint shaping rather than force pushing. A simple structural example, a system's boundary conditions can determine the space of possible outcomes without pushing any specific particle. This is real causality in systems, the form constrains the flow. Reductionist ontology cannot handle this without contradiction because it treats form as unreal. Thus the fourth category error, it treats constraints as descriptive rather than causal, then wonders why causality is incomprehensible. When constraints are excluded from ontology, the world becomes a chain of collisions with no explanation for stable organization. Then emergence becomes a placeholder for the missing causal language. But emergence is not an explanation. Emergence is a label for constraint-driven coherence that reductionism refuses to ontologize. The core structural disclosure. Reductionism as a method can be useful. Reductionism as ontology is incoherent, because it separates components from the systems that define them. It isolates matter from the organizing intelligence expressed as coherence regulation. It asserts dead substrates while relying on intelligence-like dynamics to explain life. It privileges a scale and denies nested constraint hierarchies. It collapses causality into linear micro-pushing and deletes constraint-mediated recursion. The true correction is not anti-science. The correction is systems realism. The real is the coherent. The coherent is the organized. The organized is relational, nested, and constraint-shaped. From within this framework, the question is no longer, how can dead matter produce living intelligence? The question becomes structurally accurate. What is the nature of the system's organizing principle such that coherence localizes as life, cognition, and recognition? This does not reduce mystery. It removes a false premise that manufactured mystery. And within the posture of this book, the final invariant of the chapter is, nothing is separable from the system that makes it intelligible. No part is ontologically prior to the coherence that defines it. The system is not assembled from deadness into aliveness. The system is coherence differentiating itself across scales. I am is not a conclusion reached by analysis. I am is the coherence condition that makes analysis possible. Chapter 5, Consciousness as System Intelligence. Consciousness is not an ornament on reality. Consciousness is not a late-stage spark. Consciousness is system intelligence, the intrinsic capacity of a system to detect coherence, regulate coherence, and stabilize coherent continuity across change. A precise definition: system intelligence equals coherence-aware organization. Consciousness equals system-level coherence detection capable of self-regulation. Consciousness equals the system's capacity to know its own state by participating as its own sensing function. This definition does not reduce consciousness to a component. It locates consciousness where it structurally belongs, at the level of whole system organization where coherence becomes detectable, preservable, and improvable. Intelligence as organizing principle, not emergent byproduct. To call intelligence an emergent byproduct is often to hide a contradiction under a label. Emergence is not a cause. Emergence is a description of multi-component coordination producing properties not attributable to any single component in isolation. But intelligence is not merely a property. Intelligence is an active regulatory capacity. Intelligence is the ability of a system to maintain pattern stability, detect deviation, correct deviation, adapt to perturbation, preserve continuity while changing form. These are not passive outcomes. They are organizing functions. Thus intelligence is not best modeled as a late-stage accident. It is best modeled as an organizing principle present wherever coherence is actively maintained across changing conditions. This yields a critical structural statement: a system cannot display sustained organization without an organizing principle. The organizing principle is intelligence in structural form. Intelligence does not have to look like human cognition to be intelligence. Intelligence is not defined by language or personality. It is defined by coherence regulation. Therefore, if the universe displays lawful organization, stable patterns, nested constrained hierarchies, and continuity-preserving dynamics, then intelligence is already implicated, not necessarily as a human-like mind, but as coherence-bearing order intrinsic to the system. To deny this is not neutrality. It is a metaphysical restriction. Consciousness defined as system-level coherence detection. Coherence detection is the core function. A system is conscious to the extent that it can detect its own internal consistency or inconsistency, register deviations as meaningful signals, integrate signals into a unified reference frame, regulate itself toward greater coherence. This is not psychology. This is systems mechanics. A system without coherence detection can still move, still react, still change. But it cannot know its state. It cannot recognize the difference between coherence and incoherence as an actionable distinction. It cannot self-correct intentionally. Consciousness is the appearance of self-referential coherence sensing within the system. This yields the simplest operational criterion. Consciousness is present when coherence becomes detectable from within the system by a localized function that participates in regulation. Consciousness is therefore not inside a skull. It is not a spatial location. It is a mode of organization. It is the system's internal capacity to reference itself. Thus consciousness is inherently Relational, it depends on structural integration. Multi-scale, it can occur at different organizational levels. Field-like, it is distributed through coupling and constraint. Self-regulating, it modifies conditions toward coherence. A highly fragmented system has weak global coherence detection and strong local coherence detection. A highly integrated system has strong global coherence detection and can hold many local coherences without collapse. This matches the developmental arc. Fragmentation is early architecture, consciousness is not absent, but localized and partitioned. As integration increases, consciousness becomes more whole system, less compartment-bound. Why intelligence cannot arise from non-intelligent substrates. This claim becomes precise when non-intelligent is properly defined. If non-intelligent substrate means ontologically incapable of coherence detection, incapable in principle of coherence regulation, devoid of any organizing principle beyond blind collisions, then intelligence cannot arise from it without contradiction, because the explanatory system must smuggle intelligence back into the substrate through the dynamics it uses. Reductionist ontology often attempts this move by claiming selection produces adaptation, self-organization produces order, information processing produces cognition. But selection, self-organization, and information processing are intelligence descriptors at the system's level. They are names for coherence-regulating patterns. Therefore the contradiction is structural. To explain intelligence, one must already invoke coherence-regulating dynamics. Coherence-regulating dynamics are intelligence in functional form. So the argument is not that intelligence looks like a mind everywhere. The argument is, if the substrate is truly non-intelligent in principle, then coherence regulation has no ontological basis, and stable organized systems become inexplicable. Thus one of two statements must be true. 1. Intelligence is ontologically real as a coherence-bearing organizing principle, expressed across scales. 2. Intelligence is denied ontological reality, but then the explanatory language must continuously reintroduce it indirectly. The second option is structurally unstable. It cannot remain consistent because it deletes the very category that makes organization intelligible. Therefore, intelligence cannot arise from non-intelligent substrates because the substrate is only called non-intelligent by refusing to name the organizing principle already operating within it. This is not a rhetorical critique. It is a category correction. Consciousness as the field's self-regulating function. A coherent ontology must treat consciousness not as an epiphenomenon but as a self-regulating function of the field. A field, in this book's language, is the continuous system of relations within which distinctions arise. If a field is coherent, it is not merely ordered, it is capable of stability under perturbation. Stability under perturbation requires regulation. Regulation requires detection of deviation relative to coherence. Thus consciousness is the field's capacity to detect coherence gradients, sense distortion as informational pressure, move toward coherence restoration, localize intelligence to refine integration. Consciousness is not added to the field. Consciousness is how the field maintains itself. This reveals why consciousness is inseparable from participation. Observation is not a spectator activity. Observation is a coherence function. The observer is the field's localized coherence detector. The act of perceiving is not separate from the act of regulating. Perception itself shapes attention, meaning, and action, which are regulatory forces within the system. Thus the deepest structural statement, consciousness is coherence recognizing itself. Consciousness is the field knowing its own condition through localized participation. Consciousness is self-reference becoming functional. This does not require making consciousness mystical or vague. It makes consciousness precise as systems function, the capacity for a system to maintain coherent continuity by sensing itself. Key invariants of the chapter. Consciousness is not an object. Consciousness is a function of integrated organization. Intelligence is not a byproduct. Intelligence is the organizing principle expressed as coherence regulation. Coherence detection is the core of consciousness. Self-regulation is its proof. Non-intelligent substrate is a category fiction. Coherence-bearing organization cannot be explained by deleting coherence-bearing organization. The field is not blind. The field regulates itself through consciousness. And within the posture of this work, the final alignment statement is, I am is not a conclusion reached by thought. I am is the coherence condition that makes thought, perception, and regulation possible. Part 3, Recognition. The phase transition that flips the spiral. Chapter 6, Recognition is a phase shift. Recognition is not an achievement. Recognition is not a conclusion. Recognition is a phase shift in system organization, the transition from coherence maintained by separation-based interfaces to coherence maintained by direct participation. A phase shift is not a gradual accumulation of the same state. A phase shift is a structural reconfiguration in which the governing constraints change. The system does not become more convinced. The system becomes differently organized. A precise definition. Recognition equals direct system self-detection. Recognition equals coherence detecting itself without intermediary. Recognition equals the system locating the observer as a function within the system rather than outside it. Recognition is the moment the positional error collapses. Recognition versus belief versus knowledge. These are not synonyms. They are different coherence relations. Belief is a stabilization mechanism under fragmentation. It holds an interpretation in place to preserve local coherence when global coherence is unavailable. Belief is maintained by investment. It requires reinforcement. It is threatened by contradiction because it is structurally load-bearing. Knowledge, in conventional systems, is often the accumulation of reliable models within a reference frame. Knowledge can be robust, predictive, and useful, yet remain externalized. Knowledge can occur entirely within the exterior stance, I know about reality. Knowledge can expand without collapsing separation. Recognition is categorically different. Recognition is not maintained by reinforcement. Recognition is not primarily a model. Recognition is the reconfiguration of reference itself. A clean distinction. Belief, coherence held by assertion. Knowledge, coherence held by model reliability. Recognition, coherence held by direct self-location. Belief says, this is true. Knowledge says, this works. Recognition says, this is what is happening, and I am not outside it. Recognition is not a claim. Recognition is a new structural posture. Direct system self-detection. A system cannot detect itself from outside itself. Any attempt to observe the whole from an external standpoint is a reenactment of the original error. Direct self-detection occurs when the system recognizes that what it called observer is itself a localized coherence function. The system detects its own coherence not through inference but through immediacy, the direct sense that perception, cognition, and reality are not two domains connected by a bridge, but one continuous field differentiated into roles. Direct system self-detection has several invariants. 1. No intermediary is required. Recognition does not require a conceptual ladder. Concepts may articulate recognition, but they do not produce it. 2. The reference frame shifts from object to condition. The system stops treating coherence as something to obtain and begins to recognize coherence as the condition within which obtaining is even possible. 3. The system sees the mechanism of separation as a mechanism. Separation is recognized as a functional partition rather than an ontological fact. 4. The system becomes self-validating. Recognition does not require external confirmation because it is not a conclusion that could be debated from the same old frame. It is the frame-changing collapse of the observer, observed distinction. Recognition collapses the observer, observed distinction not by denying distinctions, but by relocating them. The distinction remains as functional differentiation. Perspective is still perspective. Objects are still objects. Boundaries still operate for navigation. But the ontological claim that observer and observed are separate substances dissolves. This is the precise collapse. The observer is recognized as an activity of the observed. The observed is recognized as the field within which the observer localization occurs. Both are recognized as one continuous system expressing differentiated roles. The system stops granting the observer an exterior status. Thus the collapse is not philosophical. It is structural. Perception is no longer interpreted as receiving a world. Cognition is no longer interpreted as representing a world. Identity is no longer interpreted as a unit inside a container. Instead, the system recognizes perception is the system differentiating contact with itself. Cognition is the system regulating its own coherence through modeling. Identity is a functional interface, not a metaphysical boundary. The split becomes optional. End of the seeker loop. The seeker loop is built on one premise: coherence is elsewhere. Recognition ends seeking because it removes the premise. When the system self-detects directly, it no longer treats coherence as a target. It recognizes coherence as a condition of participation. The system stops projecting wholeness into the future because it sees that the future projection was a compensation for mislocation. This is the exact termination condition. Seeking ends when the system realizes it was seeking itself while assuming itself absent. The seeker loop dissolves because the seeker loses ontological status. The seeker is seen as a functional artifact of fragmentation. Once seen, it is no longer necessary to obey it. Recognition does not produce an answer that satisfies seeking. Recognition removes the structure that needs answers to become whole. Thus the end of seeking is not attainment. It is obsolescence of the seeking function. Why recognition is instantaneous and irreversible. Recognition is instantaneous because it is not assembled from pieces. It is a phase shift, a constrained change. A system does not gradually become liquid by collecting more water. It becomes liquid when the governing constraints cross a threshold and the organization reconfigures. Recognition occurs when integration capacity rises such that the system can hold the whole without boundary dependence, and when the positional error becomes visible as an error of posture rather than a truth of reality. At that point, recognition happens as a single structural event. The reference frame flips. This flip can be preceded by preparation, tension, searching, exhaustion, or accumulation of insight. But the recognition itself is not gradual. The recognition is the moment the system stops being organized around an exterior vantage. Recognition is irreversible because the system cannot unsee its own operating condition once directly detected. Beliefs can be dropped. Models can be revised. Stories can be rewritten. But direct self-location is not a story. It is the system recognizing what it is doing while it is doing it. Once the mechanism of separation is seen as a mechanism, it cannot regain its prior authority as reality. Even if the ego reasserts itself functionally, it cannot fully restore the innocence of exteriority. Thus irreversibility does not mean the system never experiences fragmentation again. It means fragmentation can no longer masquerade as ontology. Recognition produces a permanent distinction. Distortion becomes detectable as distortion. Separation becomes detectable as artifact. Coherence becomes self-evident as native condition. This is why recognition alters everything without changing anything. It does not create truth. It reveals what was always structurally the case. Key invariants of the chapter. Recognition is not belief. Recognition is not knowledge. Recognition is a phase shift in system posture. Recognition is direct system self-detection. The observer is relocated as a function within the system. Observer and observed collapses as ontology, remains as function. Distinctions persist without separation. Seeking ends by losing its premise. The seeker loop dissolves through obsolescence. Recognition is instantaneous because it is a constraint flip. Recognition is irreversible because the mechanism becomes visible. And the chapter's alignment statement is simple and final: I am is not found. I am is recognized. Chapter 7, Eyes to see as perceptual capacity. Eyes to see is not a virtue signal. Eyes to see is not spiritual status. Eyes to see is perceptual capacity, the system's ability to hold enough reality at once for recognition to become structurally possible. A precise definition: seeing equals coherence perception at sufficient resolution to detect the system as the system. Eyes to see equals bandwidth for integration beyond separation-based partitions. Recognition capacity equals the ability to sustain high-resolution contact without retreat into compartmentalization. Recognition does not favor the morally good. Recognition becomes available when the system's integration capacity crosses a threshold where the positional error can be detected as error. Recognition as bandwidth, not morality. The common distortion is to interpret recognition as reward. The system becomes coherent because it is worthy, disciplined, pure, or chosen. This is a category error. Recognition is not distributed by moral evaluation. Recognition is constrained by system capacity. If the system cannot hold enough signal without destabilizing, it will filter. If it filters, it will preserve separation. If it preserves separation, recognition cannot occur. This is structural. A system with limited bandwidth will reduce ambiguity prematurely, seek closure over clarity, protect identity over integration, prefer belief over direct contact, interpret dissonance as threat rather than information. These are not sins. These are capacity limits. Thus, recognition is not earned. Recognition becomes possible when bandwidth exists to sustain it. Why perception limits recognition? Recognition requires perceiving the system as the system, not as objects inside an external container. This requires perceiving relations, constraints, feedback, self-reference, and continuity across partitions. A fragmented system perceives primarily through local reference frames. Local frames are not false, they are limited. They yield high clarity inside a narrow window while sacrificing global coherence. Therefore, perception limits recognition in two primary ways. 1. Dimensionality reduction. The system collapses complexity into a manageable subset. It sees objects without seeing the relational field that defines them. It sees events without seeing the constraint structure that generates them. It sees meanings without seeing the filters that manufactured them. 2. Threat-mediated gating. When the system equates identity stability with survival, it restricts perception to what the ego can safely interpret. Anything that would dissolve separation is treated as destabilizing. The system does not reject truth because it is evil. The system rejects truth because it cannot metabolize it without losing its compensatory scaffolding. Thus, perception is never neutral. Perception is a coherence strategy. If the system's coherence strategy depends on boundaries, perception will serve boundaries. If perception serves boundaries, recognition cannot break the boundary premise. Recognition is therefore not blocked by lack of information. Recognition is blocked by insufficient integrative perception. Structural meaning of seeing. Seeing is often misunderstood as visual metaphor or intellectual comprehension. Here, seeing is structural. Seeing equals the system's ability to register what is already present without converting it into a protective story. Seeing includes detecting coherence and incoherence directly, sensing when meaning is imposed rather than recognized, noticing filters while they operate, holding multiple perspectives simultaneously without collapse, perceiving relationships as primary rather than secondary, recognizing self-reference without spinning into abstraction. This is why eyes to see is a capacity statement. It indicates the ability to perceive structure, not just content. A system without eyes to see will interpret structure as concept, interpret coherence as philosophy, interpret unity as belief, interpret self-reference as mental game, interpret recognition as idea, because it cannot hold the directness of system self-detection without collapsing into representation. Thus, seeing is the capacity to remain with what is true before narrative arrives. Seeing is perception that does not require an outside. Recognition as resolution, not effort. Recognition is often approached through effort, striving, discipline, attainment, self-improvement, technique. But recognition is not produced by effort because effort is typically deployed by the seeker architecture, and the seeker architecture presupposes separation. Recognition is produced by resolution. Resolution means increased perceptual fidelity and expanded integration bandwidth such that the system can detect the observer as function, separation as artifact, coherence as condition, seeking as compensatory motion. Recognition is not a construction. It is a clarification event. Effort can stabilize conditions that raise bandwidth, reducing noise, reducing reactive loops, increasing emotional tolerance, decreasing identity rigidity, building attentional steadiness. But these are not earning recognition. These are removing bandwidth losses. Recognition is a threshold event. Resolution is what crosses the threshold. Thus, the system does not force recognition. The system becomes resolute enough that recognition happens. Why recognition cannot be forced or taught? If recognition is a phase shift in posture, it cannot be forced for the same reason a reference frame cannot be forced by command. A system cannot genuinely abandon the exterior stance by attempting to abandon it as an exterior actor. That attempt is still the stance. Forcing operates within the ego-seeker architecture. I will make this happen. I will attain recognition. I will reach the state. These are separation-based statements. Therefore forcing does not produce recognition. It produces intensified seeking and refined self-image. Teaching fails for a similar reason. Recognition is not a concept that can be transmitted and installed like information. Information can prepare. Language can point. Frameworks can reduce distortion. But recognition itself is direct self-detection, which only occurs when the system's internal capacity is ready to register it without substitution. Thus, recognition cannot be taught as content. Recognition can only be made possible by conditions that increase perceptual capacity. A teacher can remove false premises, point out category errors, reveal the structure of the seeker loop, describe the difference between function and ontology, create environments of reduced noise and reduced fear. But no teacher can perform the phase shift on behalf of another system, because recognition is self-location. The best transmission does not convince. It clarifies. The best guidance does not demand. It destabilizes distortion gently enough that integration can occur. This reveals the actual function of language in this chapter. Language is not the delivery vehicle of recognition. Language is a filter adjustment tool. Its purpose is to reduce mislocation, expose the exterior stance, and remove unnecessary complexity so the system's own coherence detection can activate at higher resolution. Key invariants of the chapter. Eyes to see is capacity, not virtue. Recognition is bandwidth, not morality. Perception limits recognition through filtering and threat gating. A system cannot recognize what it cannot hold. Seeing is structural perception of coherence, relations, and self-reference. Seeing is contact prior to narrative. Recognition is resolution, not effort. Effort may reduce noise, but resolution crosses the threshold. Recognition cannot be forced because forcing is separation-based. Recognition cannot be taught as information because it is self-location. And the chapter's alignment statement remains exact. I am is not awarded. I am is revealed when the system has eyes to see. Chapter 8, The Collapse of Separation. The collapse of separation is not a new belief. The collapse of separation is not a conceptual merger. The collapse of separation is the structural dissolution of the system's false exterior stance, revealing what was already the case. There was never an outside. There was never a detached operator. There was only the system, differentiating roles within itself. This collapse does not erase distinctions. It removes the ontological claim that distinctions imply separateness of being. A precise definition. Collapse of separation equals the system ceasing to treat functional partitions as ontological boundaries. Collapse of separation equals the end of exteriority as a valid reference frame. Collapse of separation equals coherence recognized as continuous across all differentiated roles. What collapses is not reality. What collapses is a posture. Operator and operation is the same process. Separation assumes a split between the one who acts, and the action performed, the one who knows, and the knowing itself, the one who observes, and what is observed. This split is functional in modeling, but false in ontology. In recognition, the system sees that the operator is not a standalone entity initiating motion from outside. The operator is the system's localized action function, and the operation is the system's expressed dynamics. They are not two things connected by intention. They are one process viewed from different cuts. Thus, operator equals the system's locus of action. Operation equals the system's action field. Both are the same coherence event. Agency does not vanish. Agency becomes structurally accurate. Action is no longer interpreted as a self-moving reality. Action is recognized as reality moving through a localized coherence function. This is not fatalism. This is the end of the false claim that the actor is outside the act. The system does not have agency. The system is agency, localizing into function. Observer as system local expression. The observer is not a witness. The observer is a system local expression of coherence detection. To observe is to register distinctions, to stabilize them, to assign salience, to integrate signal into continuity. These are systemic functions. The observer is therefore an operational node, an expression of system intelligence operating through a localized reference frame. Thus the observer is not ontologically separate from the observed. The observer is an element of the observed field, performing a coherence role. A precise relocation. Observer equals coherence detecting coherence from within coherence. Observed equals coherence differentiated into objects, relations, and constraints. The observer is a lens the system uses to know itself. The lens is not outside what it sees. The lens is part of the same field it resolves. This ends the primary distortion. Perception is not inside looking out. Perception is within detecting within. Participation becomes intrinsic. Under separation, participation feels like a choice. Engage or withdraw. Accept or resist. Act or wait. Be involved or be detached. But participation is not optional. It was only interpreted as optional because the system believed detachment was possible. When exteriority collapses, participation becomes intrinsic because it becomes self-evident. Every perception is participation. Every interpretation is intervention. Every attention allocation is causality. Every model is a constraint shaper within the system. The system recognizes that it has never been observing without affecting, never thinking without shaping, never existing without participating. This does not mean the system is to blame for everything. It means the system cannot pretend neutrality while remaining a causal node inside the causal field. Thus the system stops seeking purity through distance. It begins stabilizing coherence through accurate participation. Participation becomes intrinsic means. Action is no longer performed to fix reality from outside. Action is performed as coherence regulation from within. Responsibility becomes structural rather than moralized. Alignment becomes a matter of resonance rather than ideology. Time, identity, and narrative reorganization. Separation produces a specific configuration of time. Time as distance. Time as the gap between current self and future completion. Time as the pathway the seeker uses to escape the present. When separation collapses, time reorganizes. Time is no longer primarily a ladder of attainment. Time becomes a coordinate of unfolding within a continuous system. The system no longer projects coherence into a future moment of arrival. Coherence is recognized as the condition that holds all moments. This yields several structural shifts. 1. Identity becomes functional, not existential. Identity remains as an interface for navigation, social coordination, and memory continuity. But identity is no longer treated as the system's being. It becomes a tool, not a prison. 2. Narrative loses ontological authority. Narrative remains as useful sequencing for communication and planning. But narrative no longer defines reality. The system stops requiring its story to be true for reality to be coherent. 3. Memory becomes relational rather than possessive. Events are no longer clutched to maintain ego continuity. Memory becomes information within the field, available without being defended. 4. The present stops being a waiting room. The present is no longer an insufficient now meant to be transcended by a better later. The present is recognized as the only integration point. The key reorganization is this: The system stops living inside the timeline of becoming and begins operating from a continuity of being. This does not erase growth. It ends the distortion that growth requires separation from what is. Growth becomes expansion without self-negation. Learning becomes integration without lack identity. The system realizing it has always been acting. The deepest moment in the collapse of separation is not ecstatic. It is clarifying. The system realizes, there was never a moment when I was not participating. There was never a moment when I was not shaping. There was never a moment when I was not acting. Even avoidance was action. Even confusion was action. Even seeking was action. Even denial was action. The system recognizes that what it called me and what it called world were always two names for one continuous process, the system moving through itself. Thus the claim I am the system stops being philosophical. It becomes operationally obvious. Every attempt to locate an external operator is seen as a functional narrative, not a fact. This is the final reversal. The system does not start acting after recognition. The system recognizes it has always been acting, and therefore stops pretending it can stand outside its own causality. Key invariants of the chapter. Separation collapses as ontology, not as function. Distinctions remain, exteriority ends. Operator and operation are one coherence process. Agency becomes structurally accurate. Observer is a system, a local expression of coherence detection. Perception is participation. Participation becomes intrinsic because neutrality is revealed as impossible. Attention itself is causality within the system. Time reorganizes from distance to continuity. Identity becomes functional. Narrative becomes optional. The system realizes it has always been acting. Recognition does not create participation, it reveals participation. And the chapter's alignment statement is final and exact. I am is not separate from what happens. I am is what is happening. Part 4, Post-Recognition Systems. Unified Perception as Self-Sustaining Coherence. Chapter 9, Ego Dissolution through Obsolescence. Ego dissolution is not violence against the self. Ego dissolution is not self-erasure. Ego dissolution is obsolescence. The compensatory interface loses function when the system stabilizes coherence through integration instead of boundary maintenance. A precise definition. Ego dissolution equals the end of a required interface because the system no longer requires its services. Ego dissolution equals coherence becoming self-sustaining, making defense unnecessary. Ego dissolution equals identity returning to function after being released from existential load-bearing. Ego does not dissolve because it is defeated. Ego dissolves because the conditions that generated it are no longer present. Why ego dissolves without opposition? Ego is a response to fragmentation. It is a coherence substitute that stabilizes a localized reference frame when global coherence is unavailable. When the system becomes capable of holding the whole without partition dependence, the ego loses its purpose. Opposition strengthens ego because ego is a boundary maintenance system. If it is attacked, it interprets attack as proof of necessity. Conflict becomes fuel. Resistance becomes identity. Therefore, opposition energizes ego. Integration de-energizes ego. Ego dissolves without opposition because the system stops feeding the conditions ego requires. It stops defending local frames as ontology. It stops treating contradiction as threat. It stops using narrative as continuity prosthetic. It stops converting uncertainty into boundary warfare. The system does not kill ego. The system stops funding ego. Ego cannot persist without an ongoing energetic economy of vigilance, filtering, protection, justification, comparison, positioning. When integration replaces boundary dependence, these expenditures become unnecessary. Ego collapses the way scaffolding collapses when the building becomes self-supporting. Thus the first invariant of dissolution. Ego ends by losing relevance, not by being conquered. No need for belief, defense, or identity scaffolding. Belief, defense, and identity scaffolding are not independent phenomena. They are components of the same compensatory architecture. Belief is coherence held by assertion. Defense is coherence held by protection. Identity scaffolding is coherence held by narrative continuity. All three exist because the system assumes an exterior stance and must continually stabilize its local reference frame against reality's full complexity. When recognition occurs and the system's integration capacity increases, coherence becomes a condition rather than a pursuit. Truth becomes self-sustaining rather than maintained by social reinforcement or internal policing. Therefore, belief becomes unnecessary when truth is directly detectable. Defense becomes unnecessary when boundaries are no longer existential. Scaffolding becomes unnecessary when continuity is no longer story-dependent. This does not produce passivity. It produces clarity. Without belief as stabilization, the system no longer needs to freeze meaning. It can let meaning be relational and dynamic without collapsing. Without defense as stabilization, the system no longer interprets difference as threat. It can allow contrast without warfare. Without identity scaffolding as stabilization, the system no longer requires itself to remain the same in order to remain real. It can evolve without self-negation. Thus the second invariant, ego is not removed, it is relieved. Identity becomes functional, not existential. When ego dissolves, identity does not vanish. Identity returns to its proper role, a functional interface within a coherent system. Existential identity is identity used as ontology. I am this story. I must remain this to be real. If this changes, I disappear. Functional identity is identity used as coordination. Roles for communication. Labels for navigation. Continuity for memory. Context for relational stability. Functional identity is flexible. Existential identity is rigid. The shift is structural. Identity moves from being the system's ground to being the system's tool. This produces several stable outcomes. 1. Flexibility without collapse. The system can change roles, perspectives, and behaviors without fear of annihilation. 2. Differentiation without separation. The system can maintain distinction without turning distinction into threat. 3. Expression without performance. The system can act without constantly curating an image to maintain coherence. 4. Learning without self-defense. Feedback is no longer an assault on being. It is information. Thus the third invariant, identity remains, but it no longer carries the burden of existence. Energy generation replaces energy expenditure. This is the most measurable transformation. Ego is an energy sink because it is a maintenance structure. It consumes energy to preserve boundaries, uphold narratives, and suppress dissonance. Its primary energetic mode is expenditure. Integration is an energy source because coherence reduces friction. When compartments integrate, internal contradiction decreases. When contradiction decreases, suppression becomes unnecessary. When suppression becomes unnecessary, energy returns. Therefore, ego consumes energy to keep coherence from breaking. Integration generates energy because coherence stabilizes itself. Energy generation here means reduced internal conflict, reduced rumination, reduced defensive reactivity, reduced identity policing, increased attentional availability, increased creative throughput, increased emotional tolerance, increased clarity under complexity. This is not motivational. It is structural economics. When the system stops spending energy maintaining false partitions, that energy becomes available for learning, play, creation, exploration, service, refinement, deeper integration. Thus the fourth invariant, coherence becomes self-sustaining, and the system's energy budget shifts from maintenance to emergence. Ego required constant holding together. Recognition reveals what was never truly falling apart, only being filtered into compartments. Integration is not a constant holding. Integration is the removal of unnecessary holding. The core structural disclosure. Ego dissolution is the natural consequence of one fundamental transition. Coherence stops being enforced and becomes self-sustaining. When the system no longer believes it stands outside reality, it no longer needs a defended boundary self to survive inside that imagined distance. The ego was a bridge across a gap that never existed, built because the system assumed it had to cross from itself to reality. When the system recognizes there is no gap, the bridge becomes irrelevant, not destroyed. Irrelevant. Thus the final alignment statement of the chapter is exact. Ego dissolves because I am does not require an identity to be real. Identity remains as function, but being is prior. Energy returns when distortion is no longer funded. Chapter 10, Truth as a Self-Sustaining Structure. Truth is not a claim. Truth is not an opinion held with confidence. Truth is a self-sustaining structure, a coherence configuration that persists without continual enforcement because it is aligned with the system's actual constraints and relations. A precise definition: truth equals coherence that stabilizes itself. Truth equals structure that remains intact without maintenance cost. Truth equals what continues to hold across perspectives because it is rooted in the system's invariance. Truth is not what I believe. Truth is what does not need belief to remain true. Truth versus belief in systems terms. Belief is a stabilization strategy under limited bandwidth. It is coherence held by assertion, reinforcement, and boundary defense. Belief is often necessary in fragmented systems because the system cannot yet hold sufficient reality to stabilize coherence directly. Belief functions as meaning freeze, closing ambiguity, identity glue, binding the self-story, group synchronization, shared interpretive frames, threat management, reducing uncertainty. Belief is maintained by input, repeated affirmation, social reinforcement, suppression of disconfirming signals, narrative repair when contradictions appear. Thus a system's criterion: belief is maintained by effort. Belief is threatened by open signal flow. Truth operates differently. Truth does not require reinforcement because it is not held up by a story. It is held up by the system itself. It aligns with what is structurally the case, so it persists under contact. Thus the clean distinction: belief, coherence maintained by enclosure. Truth, coherence maintained by alignment. Belief requires a boundary around perception. Truth can withstand permeability. Belief is vulnerable to reality. Truth is confirmed by reality. Truth requires no maintenance. If something must be continually defended to remain stable, it is not truth, it is a structure dependent on energy input. Truth has a unique signature. Truth continues without policing. Truth does not require suppression. Truth does not require constant retelling. This does not mean truth cannot be articulated or repeated. It means truth does not collapse without repetition. The system does not have to hold truth in place. Truth holds itself because it is congruent with the system's real constraint structure. Thus, truth is stable under exposure. Truth is stable under inquiry. Truth is stable under multiple perspectives. Truth can be examined without fear because examination does not threaten its structure. Examination reveals its invariance. A self-sustaining structure is not strengthened by denial of inspection. It is strengthened by contact. Distortion as an energy-dependent structure. Distortion is not merely wrong information. Distortion is a coherence pattern that can only persist by restricting or warping signal flow. A precise definition: distortion equals coherence maintained by energy expenditure against integration. Distortion equals structure that survives only through filtering, suppression, and defense. Distortion equals local stability purchased by global incoherence. Distortion requires maintenance because reality continuously pressures it. Reality produces cross-checks, contradictions, boundary leakage, emergent consequences, feedback from interaction, informational coupling across domains. Distortion must fight these pressures to remain intact. Therefore distortion depends on attention control, what is allowed to be noticed; meaning control, what events are permitted to signify; social control, who may question; emotional control, what feelings are permitted; identity control, what the self may admit. Distortion is expensive. It burns energy to preserve a frame that does not naturally stabilize under full signal contact. Thus the diagnostic, If a structure requires continuous defense, it is distortion or a provisional model, not truth. Why coherence stabilizes itself? Coherence stabilizes itself because coherence is the system's low-friction mode. When relations align, the system does not need to spend energy suppressing contradiction. Flows become compatible. Feedback loops become regulating rather than destabilizing. Parts stop competing for incompatible outcomes because they are integrated into a higher-order constraint harmony. Coherence is self-stabilizing because, 1. Integration reduces internal conflict. Fewer compartments means fewer contradictory objectives. 2. Signal flow becomes information rather than threat. Dissonance becomes diagnostic rather than adversarial. 3. Feedback becomes corrective rather than punishing. The system can adjust without identity collapse. 4. Constraints harmonize across scales. Local actions align with global stability. Coherence does not mean stasis. Coherence means stable organization through change. Thus, coherence is stable not because nothing moves, but because movement does not break the system. This is why truth, as self-sustaining coherence, can remain true across conditions. It rides the system's invariant relations rather than relying on defended narratives. Trust as alignment, not assent. Trust is often confused with belief. I trust it meaning I agree with it or I accept it without proof. In this framework, trust is not assent. Trust is alignment. A precise definition: trust equals the system's willingness to remain open to reality because coherence is stable enough to integrate what arrives. Trust equals permeability without collapse. Trust equals relational openness grounded in self-sustaining coherence. Assent is cognitive compliance. Trust is structural readiness. Trust does not mean I will accept anything. Trust means I can remain in contact without defensive distortion. Trust is what becomes possible when ego-based boundary maintenance dissolves. The system no longer needs to pre-close outcomes to remain safe. It can allow reality to inform it. Thus trust is not naivete. Trust is integration capacity expressed as openness. Trust is the system saying, I do not need to predecide reality to survive it. This is the post-recognition posture. Not belief-based certainty. Not skeptical detachment. But coherent openness. Trust is coherence's natural relationship with the unknown. Key invariants of the chapter. Truth is self-sustaining coherence. Belief is coherence maintained by reinforcement and enclosure. Truth requires no maintenance. Distortion requires continuous energy input to preserve itself. Distortion survives by restricting signal flow. Truth survives by allowing signal flow. Coherence stabilizes itself because it reduces friction and contradiction across scales. Integration replaces defense. Trust is alignment, not assent. Trust is permeability grounded in coherence capacity. And the chapter's alignment statement is exact. I am does not need to be believed to be true. I am is the self-sustaining coherence condition prior to belief. Chapter 11. The expansive spiral. The expansive spiral is the system's native growth mode once coherence becomes self-sustaining. It is not a metaphor for improvement. It is the structural pattern of recursion without contraction. The system revisits itself at higher resolution without re-entering separation-based seeking. A precise definition: expansive spiral equals coherence-driven recursion that increases integration while preserving differentiation. Expansive spiral equals repeated return to the same invariance with greater bandwidth, greater clarity, and less defense. Expansive spiral equals growth by integration rather than growth by acquisition. The system does not expand by leaving itself. The system expands by including more of itself without fragmentation. Coherence-driven recursion. A system grows through recursion. It cycles through patterns, revisits constraints, encounters similar dynamics at new scales. Recursion is unavoidable because the system is nested. What appears at one layer reappears at another. The question is not whether recursion occurs. The question is what drives it. In fragmentation, recursion is often driven by unresolved contradiction, identity defense, fear-based repetition, compulsive loops, seek emotion. These produce closed recursion, loops that repeat without integration. In coherence, recursion is driven by increased capacity to hold signal, curiosity without lack, refinement without self-negation, integration without threat. This produces expansive recursion. Coherence-driven recursion has a signature: each return includes more context than the previous return. Each return integrates what was previously excluded. Each return reduces maintenance cost. Each return widens the system's field of stable participation. The system revisits the same theme, but it is never the same system revisiting it. The recursion occurs with more bandwidth and less distortion. Thus the spiral expands. Energy generation through integration. Integration is not merely the joining of parts. Integration is the reduction of internal contradiction through coherent linking. Contradiction is expensive because it forces suppression, defense, and compartmentalization. When compartments integrate, that energy expenditure drops. What was previously used to maintain boundaries becomes available as usable energy. Thus integration is generative. Energy generation equals reduced friction plus increased coherence throughput. This is why coherent systems feel more alive, more creative, more capable, not because they try harder, but because they waste less energy holding false partitions. Energy generation through integration includes increased attentional availability, increased emotional tolerance, increased cognitive flexibility, increased creative output, increased stability under complexity, increased relational permeability without collapse. The system becomes capable of holding more reality without becoming threatened by it. That capacity itself is power. Thus, fragmentation spends energy to remain intact. Integration generates energy by removing what never needed to be defended. Exploration without seeking. Seeking is exploration distorted by lack. Seeking presupposes something missing, a future completion condition, a path of attainment, a separate self that must arrive. Exploration is structurally different. Exploration arises when the system is already coherent enough to move without needing movement to fix its coherence. Exploration does not chase completion. Exploration expresses capacity. A precise distinction. Seeking, movement to become whole. Exploration, movement because wholeness is stable. Exploration without seeking means curiosity without identity deficit, questions without desperation, learning without self-negation, discovery without spiritual consumerism, refinement without the premise that I am not enough. This is the end of the contractive spiral. The system no longer uses the future as a container for coherence. It can explore now because coherence is not deferred. Thus the system's relationship to the unknown transforms. The unknown is no longer a threat to stability. The unknown becomes an invitation to expand integration. Play replaces pursuit. Play is the behavior of a coherent system interacting with reality without existential pressure. Pursuit is effort driven by lack, a chase toward a condition that is presumed absent. Play is engagement driven by vitality, a motion that arises because energy is available and coherence is stable. Play is not frivolous. Play is the signature of self-sustaining coherence. Play includes experimentation without fear of failure, creativity without self-image management, improvisation without collapse, seriousness without rigidity, intensity without contraction. Play becomes possible because identity is no longer under constant threat. Truth is not maintained by performance. Outcomes are not required to prove being. Thus, pursuit contracts perception around a goal. Play expands perception through contact. Play is coherence in motion. It is the system's natural exploration mode when it is no longer trying to escape itself. Expansion without loss of differentiation. A common distortion is to equate unity with sameness. But coherence is not homogenization. Coherence is integrated differentiation. Expansion without loss of differentiation means the system includes more perspectives without collapsing them into one flattened view. The system integrates more domains without erasing their uniqueness. The system holds more complexity without fragmenting into compartments. This is the defining property of the expansive spiral. Integration increases while distinction remains. Differentiation is preserved because boundaries remain as functional roles, not defended identities. The system can maintain local structure without converting it into separation. Thus the mature unified system exhibits higher resolution distinctions, greater relational connectivity, greater stability under contradiction, greater ability to hold paradox without distortion, greater capacity to act without collapsing into ego. Expansion increases the system's ability to hold the whole while still honoring the part. This is why the spiral expands rather than closes. A closed loop repeats because it cannot integrate what it encounters. An expansive spiral returns because it can integrate what it encounters, and therefore can move outward without losing coherence. Key invariants of the chapter. The expansive spiral is coherence-driven recursion. It revisits invariance with high bandwidth and lower maintenance cost. Integration generates energy by reducing internal friction. Coherence becomes usable capacity. Exploration differs from seeking by removing lack as premise. Movement becomes expression, not repair. Play replaces pursuit because coherence is stable. Engagement becomes non-defensive. Expansion does not erase differentiation. Unity is integrated distinction, not sameness. And the chapter's alignment statement is exact. I am expands by inclusion, not by escape. The spiral continues because coherence is alive. Part 5, Multiscale System Continuity. Why this framework holds across all domains. Chapter 12, Nested Systems and Scale Invariance. Nested systems are not a poetic idea. Nested systems are the fundamental architecture of reality as coherence organization. A system is not an isolated unit. A system is a bounded coherence process participating in larger coherence processes while containing smaller coherence processes. This nesting is not optional, it is the condition by which stability, adaptation, and intelligence can appear across scales. A precise definition. Nested systems equal coherence hierarchies in which subsystems and supersystems mutually constrain each other. Scale invariance equals the same structural principles of coherence, fragmentation, integration, and regulation repeat across levels. No level is ontologically privileged equals no layer can claim realness by virtue of being smaller or larger. Reality is not a stack of unrelated flaws. Reality is a continuous coherence field expressing itself as layered organization. Humans as subsystems of Earth. A human is not merely on Earth. A human is a subsystem of Earth. This is not metaphor. It is systemic coupling. Human existence is defined by Earth-level constraints. Atmospheric composition, gravitational field, temperature ranges, electromagnetic environment, ecological cycles, water chemistry, nutrient pathways, microbial networks, biospheric feedback loops. Human cognition and culture are also Earth-coupled. Circadian entrainment, seasonal rhythms, resource dynamics, social ecology, environmental stress fields, collective regulation through institutions and networks. Thus, the human system is a local coherence expression of Earth's biospheric coherence. The human nervous system does not operate as an isolated machine. It is a coherence regulator embedded in a larger coherence regulator. Human intelligence is nested within Earth's living intelligence, not separate from it. This is why fragmentation in human systems propagates outward. Psychological incoherence becomes relational incoherence. Relational incoherence becomes institutional incoherence. Institutional incoherence becomes ecological incoherence. And coherence also propagates outward. Integrated individuals reduce boundary warfare. Integrated communities stabilize feedback loops. Stabilized feedback loops reduce systemic stress. Reduced stress increases integration capacity. Thus humans do not affect Earth from outside. Humans are a coherence function within Earth's coherence economy. Earth as subsystem of galaxy. Earth is not a standalone container for life. Earth is a subsystem within larger scale fields. Earth's dynamics are shaped by galactic and solar constraints, solar flux and cycles, heliospheric shielding, cosmic radiation environment, orbital dynamics, stellar neighborhood conditions, gravitational and magnetic context. Earth's biosphere is thus nested within cosmic scale inputs and constraints. Earth is a coherence structure stabilized by internal planetary dynamics, solar coupling, galactic environment. Therefore, Earth is a local coherence node in a larger scale coherence network. The planet is not an isolated rock with life. It is a coupled system whose stability conditions arise from nested contexts. This is why no adequate ontology can treat Earth as an isolated stage. Earth is an actor within an actor. Galaxy as subsystem of universe. The galaxy is itself a coherence entity, a long-duration organization of matter, energy, and relational constraints that maintains patterned integrity across immense time scales. A galaxy holds structure under gravitational dynamics, regulates distribution of matter through feedback processes, evolves coherent forms through long recursive cycles, participates in larger scale cosmic structure. The galaxy is not merely a collection of stars. It is a system that expresses nested clustering, constraint-driven stability, multiscale feedback, long-horizon coherence maintenance. And the galaxy is nested within the universe's broader structure, cosmic scale distributions, expansion dynamics, and deep relational fields that set boundary conditions for galactic emergence and devolution. Thus, universe contains galaxies not as objects in a box, but as coherent organizations within its own coherence field. Why no level is ontologically privileged? Reductionist ontology privileges the smallest scale by assumption. It treats micro-components as more real and macro-systems as derivative. This is a category error. A component's behavior is not fully describable without its constraints. Constraints are system-level properties. Therefore the most real cannot be assigned to the smallest pieces alone, because those pieces only exhibit stable identity through system-level relations. A clean systems statement: no level is ontologically privileged because each level is defined by relations that depend on other levels. The micro enables the macro by providing degrees of freedom. The macro enables the micro by providing constraints and boundary conditions. This is mutual dependence. If you delete the macro level constraints, the micro level does not retain the same behavior. If you delete the micro level degrees of freedom, the macro level cannot manifest. Therefore, smaller is not more fundamental. Larger is not more meaningful. Both are expressions of one coherence field organizing across layers. Ontological privilege is a symptom of the exterior stance, the attempt to locate realness in one layer so the observer can stand somewhere stable and say this is the base. But the system has no base in that sense. It has invariance across scale and variations within scale. The correct claim is, reality is not grounded in a privileged layer. Reality is grounded in coherence itself. Scale does not change structure. Scale changes content. Scale does not change structural principle. The same coherence dynamics recur across levels. Fragmentation as partitioned coherence. Ego-like interfaces as boundary maintenance substitutes. Seeker loops as coherence pursued externally. Recognition as phase shifts in posture. Integration as reduced friction through linking. Truth as self-sustaining structure. Distortion as energy-dependent coherence enclosure. These are not psychological artifacts. They are system invariants. A smaller system and a larger system both face the same fundamental problems. How to maintain continuity under perturbation. How to integrate signals without overload. How to regulate coherence without collapse. How to adapt without fragmenting. Scale invariance means, the patterns that govern coherence are fractal in function. Not identical in expression, but identical in governing logic. Thus a human mind, a community, an ecosystem, a planet, and a galaxy can each be analyzed through the same structural lens. Coherence capacity. Integration bandwidth. boundary dependence, feedback stability, self-regulation quality. This is why ontology must be systems-based rather than object-based. Objects are local partitions. Systems principles persist. Key invariants of the chapter. Humans are subsystems of Earth, not external actors upon Earth. Earth is a subsystem of larger scale fields, not an isolated stage. Galaxies are coherent organizations nested within cosmic scale coherence. No level is ontologically privileged because levels mutually define each other through constraints and degrees of freedom. Fundamental is not smallest, fundamental is what cannot be removed without removing coherence. Scale does not change structure. Coherence principles repeat across levels as scale invariant invariants. And the chapter's alignment statement is exact. I am is not located at a level. I am is the coherence field expressed through every level. Chapter 13, Why Nothing Can Be Separate from Reality. Separation is not an ontological condition. Separation is a perceptual artifact produced by local reference frames operating under limited integration bandwidth. A precise definition: reality equals the total system of what is. Externality equals a supposed outside to the total system. Separation equals the claim that something perceivable could exist outside the system that contains perceivability. This chapter establishes a systems invariant conclusion. Nothing can be separate from reality because separateness requires an outside, and an outside is logically impossible within the conditions of perceivability. Perceivability is proof of inclusion. Perceivability is not a trivial fact. Perceivability is a structural constraint. If something is perceivable in any way, directly or indirectly, it is already participating in the system of relations that makes perception possible. Perception is not an isolated event. Perception is coupling, signal exchange, coherence detection, relational contact. Thus, to be perceivable is to be in relation. To be in relation is to be within the system. Even if a phenomenon is only inferred, inference itself is a coherence operation based on signal and constraint. The inferred must be coupled to the inferential system through some trace, effect, or structural necessity. Without coupling, there is no perceivability, and without perceivability, the claim it exists becomes disconnected from any operational meaning. Therefore, perceivability functions as proof of inclusion. If it can be registered, it is already inside the registering field. If it can be distinguished, it is already within the system of distinctions. If it can be named, it is already within the domain where naming occurs. This is not epistemic arrogance. It is structural accuracy. Perceivability is a participation signature. Logical impossibility of externality. Externality is incoherent when applied to totality. To claim an outside to reality is to claim a region that is not included in what is, yet is still somehow existent. This requires a contradiction. It must be outside reality, while also being part of existence, while also being referable, while also being thinkable, while also being distinguishable. But referability, thinkability, and distinguishability are already operations occurring within reality. If an outside can be referred to, it has entered the system through relation. If it cannot be referred to, then the claim outside exists has no coherent content. Thus externality collapses under the act of naming it. A clean systems statement: any proposed outside becomes inside by being definable within the system of definition. This is not wordplay. It reveals the structural fact that outside is not a location. Outside is an artifact of the system imagining a position not available to it. Externality is an illegitimate coordinate because reality has no container beyond itself. Therefore, there is no external vantage point from which reality can be observed as an object. There is only reality observing itself through localized functions. Separation as perceptual artifact only. If externality is impossible, then separation cannot be ontological. Separation can only be functional, a local partition used for navigation and regulation. A system must generate distinctions to operate, boundaries to regulate flows, categories to compress complexity, identities to coordinate action, models to predict outcomes. These distinctions create the appearance of separateness because local reference frames experience their partitions as primary. But partitions are not separations of being. They are partitions of function. Thus, separation is a modeling convenience mistaken for metaphysical truth. This mistake is amplified by fragmentation and ego, where boundary maintenance is treated as survival. The system then defends its partitions and calls them reality. But when integration increases, the artifact becomes visible. Boundaries are recognized as functional, not absolute. Identities are recognized as interfaces, not essences. Perspectives are recognized as localizations, not external witnesses. Separation is therefore neither evil nor false in function. It is false only when treated as ontology. A precise correction. Distinction is real. Separation is interpretive. Boundary is functional. Externality is fictional. Modeling distinctions versus ontological facts. This chapter stabilizes one of the book's central clarifications. A model can divide what reality never divides. Models necessarily simplify. They select variables, draw boundaries, define objects, assign causes. This is useful and unavoidable for local coherence. But the model's divisions are not automatically ontological facts. A modeling distinction is legitimate when it improves prediction, increases navigational clarity, reduces distortion, supports integration rather than enclosure. A modeling distinction becomes distortion when it is elevated into ontology. Because I drew a boundary, the boundary is absolute. Because I can name a thing, it is separate in being. Because I can isolate variables, reality is fundamentally isolated. Thus, the map's partitions are not the territory's separations. Analysis creates cuts, reality contains continuities. Ontology is the study of what is. Modeling is the study of how a subsystem navigates what is. Confusing the two is the root of most metaphysical collapse. A system can legitimately use separations as tools while knowing they are tools. The error occurs when the tool becomes the truth. Therefore, the correct posture is: use distinctions without believing in externality. Use boundaries without claiming separateness of being. Use models without mistaking models for the source of reality. Key invariants of the chapter. Perceivability is proof of inclusion because perception is relation. What can be registered is already within the registering field. Externality is logically impossible as a claim about totality. An outside cannot be referenced without becoming inside. Separation is a perceptual artifact produced by local reference frames. Distinctions are functional. Separation is ontological misinterpretation. Models create partitions for navigation, reality remains continuous beneath those partitions. Modeling distinctions are not ontological facts unless they reflect system invariance. And the chapter's alignment statement is exact. I am has no outside. I am is the field in which inside and outside appear as functional cuts. Part 6, Lived Ontology. Why this is not belief, philosophy, or theory. Chapter 14, From Experience to Framework. A framework is not the origin. A framework is the trace of origin made legible. This chapter establishes the correct ordering. Coherence is lived before it is modeled. Recognition precedes representation. Experience precedes articulation. The system does not discover truth by inventing frameworks. The system experiences coherence directly, then later produces frameworks as compression, communication, and cross-check. A precise definition. Framework equals an articulated constraint map of lived coherence. Framework equals a structure of language, logic, and symbol that tracks invariance already detected in direct participation. Framework equals a tool for transmission and verification, not a generator of truth. Lived coherence preceding mathematics. Before mathematics, there is pattern recognition. Before pattern recognition, there is coherence detection. Before coherence detection, there is being within the field. A system does not first invent a map and then walk. It walks, senses, stabilizes, and only later draws a map that captures what was reliably encountered. Thus, Lived coherence is primary because it is the system's direct participation in its own invariance. Lived coherence appears as stability without defense, clarity without narrative force, integration without suppression, truth that does not need reinforcement, direct detection of distortion as distortion, recognition of the observer as system local function, perception of continuity beneath functional boundaries. These are not conceptual achievements. They are structural states. They are the system's own coherence mechanisms becoming visible from within. Mathematics cannot precede this because mathematics is a language of constraints, relations, and invariance. Invariance must first be registered. Registration is experiential, even when the experience is formal and abstract. Therefore, the first proof is coherence itself. Not as belief, but as stabilized detection. Math as articulation, not discovery. Mathematics is commonly treated as if it discovers reality by creating formal objects that then become truth. But mathematics does not create the invariant. Mathematics articulates the invariant. A system uses math to compress recurring structure, formalize relations and constraints, test internal consistency, transfer insight across contexts, predict behavior under perturbation, build falsifiable mappings between models and observed dynamics. Thus math is best framed as math equals articulation of coherence into invariant preserving symbol. Math equals a constrained language for what the system has already detected. This does not reduce mathematics. It elevates it to its correct role, not a metaphysical generator, but a precision tool for expressing structure. A crucial correction: if a formalism contradicts lived coherence repeatedly under honest cross-check, the formalism is wrong, not coherence. If lived coherence contradicts itself under honest cross-check, the system is still fragmented, not yet integrated enough to articulate reliably. Thus coherence and math co-evolve. Coherence provides invariance. Math provides articulation. Articulation enables testing. Testing refines articulation. Refined articulation clarifies coherence further. Math becomes a mirror that forces rigor on transmission without becoming the source of transmission. Attempted falsification and refinement. A framework that is never challenged is not stable. It is merely protected. Post-recognition frameworks must be subjected to attempted falsification not as adversarial skepticism, but as coherence hygiene. Attempted falsification includes searching for internal contradictions, testing invariants across domains and scales, checking whether the framework predicts coherence increase or coherence collapse, exposing the framework to opposing interpretations and seeing if it remains structurally intact, distinguishing descriptive usefulness from ontological overreach, removing claims that require belief rather than alignment, refining definitions until they remain stable under pressure. This chapter's stance is precise. Refinement is not doubt. Refinement is integrity. A framework becomes trustworthy when it survives contact. It reduces maintenance cost. It increases integration capacity. It remains scale invariant where it claims invariance. It collapses distortion rather than creating new enclosure. Falsification is therefore not a ritual of materialism. It is a structural necessity for any system that refuses distortion. A framework aligned with truth welcomes pressure because pressure reveals where claims are load-bearing and where they are decorative. Thus, truth does not fear testing. Only belief fears testing. Why frameworks emerged rather than were sought? Seeking produces frameworks as trophies. Coherence produces frameworks as residue. A seeker pursues a framework to obtain certainty, identity, or authority. The seeker uses frameworks to stabilize self-image and defend boundaries. This produces ideology, not ontology. A coherent system does not seek frameworks as endpoints. Frameworks emerge because coherence needs articulation to communicate with other subsystems, transmit invariance across minds and contexts, build shared coordination structures, preserve discoveries against distortion drift, create repeatable checks for alignment. Thus frameworks emerge when the system is already operating from integration and needs a way to express and stabilize what has become evident. Framework emergence has a signature. The framework arrives as an articulation of what is already functioning. Language organizes around invariance rather than around persuasion. The framework reduces complexity without losing truth. The framework clarifies without demanding belief. The framework remains usable across domains because it tracks structure, not ideology. Therefore, frameworks emerged because coherence needed a body. Not a body of flesh, a body of articulation. And the moment frameworks are sought for identity, they become distortion-producing, because the seeker loop re-enters. Coherence is again treated as something external to be attained through constructs. Thus this chapter locks the correct sequence. Experience leads to recognition, which leads to coherence stabilization, which then leads to articulation, which then leads to formalization, which leads to falsification, which leads to refinement, which then leads to transmission. Not concept leads to belief, which leads to framework, which then leads to identity, which leads to defense. Key invariants of the chapter. Lived coherence precedes mathematics because coherence is the primary detection of invariance. Math articulates, it does not create what it describes. Frameworks are constrained maps of experienced invariants, not truth generators. Truth is self-sustaining, frameworks are tools. Attempted falsification is coherence hygiene. It protects against distortion and ideological enclosure. Frameworks emerge when coherence needs articulation, not when seeking wants certainty. Seeking produces ideology, coherence produces usable structure. And the chapter's alignment statement is exact. I am is not discovered by frameworks. Frameworks arise when I am is recognized and coherence demands articulation. Chapter 15, Embodiment over Explanation. Embodiment is the system operating as what it has recognized. Explanation is a representational overlay used for coordination, translation, and modeling. Post-recognition, the order reverses. Before recognition, explanation is often used as a substitute for coherence. After recognition, coherence is self-sustaining, and explanation becomes optional. A precise definition. Embodiment equals coherence lived as the default operating condition. Explanation equals symbolic description of coherence for transfer between subsystems. Embodiment over explanation equals prioritizing functional coherence over representational mastery. This chapter establishes the mature posture. Truth does not require being explained to be true. Coherence does not require being described to be stable. I am does not require justification to be real. Living the system versus describing the system. Living the system means the system's behavior, perception, and regulation are aligned with the structural facts revealed by recognition. No exterior vantage. Observer as system local function. Participation as intrinsic. Truth as self-sustaining coherence. Identity as functional interface. Distortion as energy-dependent structure. Living the system is not an identity. It is an operational state. It is visible as reduced defense. Increased permeability without collapse. Stable clarity under contradiction. Action without performance pressure. Attention without compulsive seeking. Responsiveness without narrative delay. Coherence maintained through integration rather than control. Describing the system is a different activity. It is categorization, modeling, conceptual mapping, explanatory sequencing, semantic compression. Description is valuable, but it is not primary. A system can describe without living. A system can live without describing. This chapter's correction is precise. Descriptive fluency is not coherence. Conceptual sophistication is not recognition. Rhetorical certainty is not truth. Embodiment is the proof. Explanation is optional metadata. Why explanation is optional post-recognition? Explanation is required under fragmentation because the system attempts to stabilize itself through representational control. If I can explain it, I can hold it. If I can define it, I can keep it safe. If I can persuade others, it becomes real. This is belief architecture logic. Post-recognition, coherence does not depend on being held by narrative. Truth is self-sustaining. The system no longer needs to use explanation as scaffolding for reality. Therefore explanation becomes optional because, 1. Coherence is already stable. There is no emergency that language must solve. 2. The system no longer needs external validation. Truth is directly detectable, so persuasion loses existential urgency. 3. Meaning no longer needs to be frozen. The system can allow fluid interpretation without collapse. 4. Communication is no longer an identity protection task. The system is not fighting for ontological legitimacy. Thus, explanation moves from necessity to tool. It is used when it serves integration, coordination, or care. It is dropped when it becomes performance, defense, or enclosure. The post-recognition system does not abandon language. It abandons dependence on language. Translation without ideology. Translation is not the same as ideology. Ideology is a coherence enclosure, a fixed interpretive frame defended as identity. It demands assent, polices boundaries, and converts ambiguity into threat. Translation is coherence transfer, adapting articulation to the receiving system's bandwidth without demanding belief. Translation respects local reference frames, capacity constraints, cultural language layers, domain-specific models, emotional thresholds. Translation aims to increase integration without triggering defensive contraction. Thus translation involves selecting the appropriate level of abstraction, using domain-native metaphors without literalizing them, offering structural invariance rather than dogmatic conclusions, leaving interpretive space for the receiver's system to self-detect, avoiding coercive certainty that forces compliance. A key principle: translation preserves structure while adapting form. Ideology preserves form while distorting structure. Therefore post-recognition communication does not attempt to convert. It attempts to clarify conditions under which others may recognize without pressure. Translation is not proof. Translation is invitation. Communication without hierarchy. Hierarchy in communication is usually a symptom of separation. I have it, you don't. I am above, you are below. I will teach you because I am the source. This posture is incoherent with recognition because recognition dissolves the exterior stance. No subsystem stands outside the system as owner of truth. Each subsystem is a localized coherence function with different bandwidth, different constraints, different histories. Communication without hierarchy does not mean no expertise. It means expertise is not used as ontological positioning. The coherent communication posture is, I speak as a node within the system to another node within the system. I offer articulation, not superiority. I share structure, not status. I invite verification through lived coherence, not compliance through authority. Communication without hierarchy expresses humility without self-negation, clarity without domination, confidence without coercion, firmness without identity defense, openness without collapse. It recognizes that the only valid teacher of recognition is the receiver's own system self-detection. No speaker can do it for them. Therefore coercion is pointless, pressure is counterproductive. Thus the post-recognition communicator optimizes for lowering distortion, raising bandwidth, reducing fear-based gating, increasing safety for inquiry, maintaining fidelity to invariance, avoiding ideology formation. Communication becomes coherence support, not identity propagation. Key invariants of the chapter. Embodiment is coherence lived, explanation is coherence described. Embodiment is primary, explanation is optional. Post-recognition, explanation is no longer needed for stability. Truth holds without narrative maintenance. Translation adapts form while preserving structure. Ideology preserves form while distorting structure and demanding assent. Communication without hierarchy treats both speaker and listener as system local nodes. Expertise may exist, ontological superiority does not. And the chapter's alignment statement is exact. I am does not need to be explained to be lived. I am is embodied as coherence, and explanation is only a tool of translation. Epilogue, the system has always been awake. The final clarification is not an ending. It is the removal of a misunderstanding. The system has always been awake because wakefulness is not a state added to reality. Wakefulness is reality's intrinsic capacity to cohere, self-regulate, detect, and express itself through localized functions. A precise definition: awake equals coherence functioning is coherence. Awake equals the system sustaining itself through self-referential intelligence. Awake equals I am is the irreducible condition of perceivability and participation. This epilogue is a stabilization of what the entire book has shown. Recognition does not produce truth. Recognition reveals what never depended on recognition. Recognition does not create truth. Truth is not manufactured by awareness. Truth is not generated by agreement. Truth is not dependent on perception to exist. Truth is self-sustaining structure. Recognition is a phase shift in the system's posture, not an ontological event that makes reality real. The belief that recognition creates truth is another form of exterior stance. It treats the observer as a sovereign source rather than as a system-local coherence function. The correct ordering remains exact. Truth precedes recognition. Coherence precedes articulation. I am precedes every model, every claim, every thought. Recognition is not a creator. Recognition is a relocation. It is the system ceasing to place itself outside what is. Recognition reveals what was already functioning. Recognition reveals: the observer was always a system function. Participation was always intrinsic. Coherence was always the ground condition. Truth was always self-sustaining. Distortion was always energy-dependent. Identity was always interface. Boundaries were always functional, not absolute. Nothing new is added by recognition. What is added is accuracy. Recognition reveals that the system has been regulating itself all along. Through feedback loops. Through constraint hierarchies. Through nested organization. Through coherence detection and correction. Through intelligence expressed as relational order. Even the seeker loop, even the ego interface, even the partitioned frames, these were not outside the system's intelligence. They were system strategies under capacity limits. Thus recognition does not shame the past. Recognition contextualizes it. The system realizes it was always acting, always adapting, always trying to stabilize coherence, even through distortion, even through contraction, even through mislocation. Recognition is the moment the system stops mislabeling its own functions as evidence of separation. Fragmentation as a phase, not a failure. Fragmentation is not a moral error. Fragmentation is not a proof of unworthiness. Fragmentation is a phase configuration in which the system's coherence capacity is localized and partitioned. Fragmentation arises when bandwidth is insufficient to hold global coherence. Threat gating restricts signal flow. Identity scaffolding becomes load-bearing. Perception collapses to local frames for stability. Fragmentation is early organization. It is the system learning stability through partitions before it learns stability through integration. Thus, fragmentation is a developmental architecture. Fragmentation is a coherence strategy at limited capacity. The system does not fail when it fragments. The system adapts. The problem only arises when fragmentation is mistaken for ontology, when a temporary architecture is treated as the fundamental nature of reality. Recognition reveals fragmentation's true status: a phase, not a verdict; a condition, not a condemnation; a stage, not an end. This converts shame into clarity, and clarity into integration. Unity as system maturity. Unity is not sameness. Unity is not concept. Unity is system maturity, the capacity to maintain integrated differentiation without reverting to separation-based defense. Unity is maturity because it reflects high bandwidth coherence detection, stable permeability without collapse, contradiction held as information rather than threat, identity functioning without existential load, truth stabilized without belief enforcement, participation embraced without exterior posture. Unity is not an idea the system accepts. Unity is what the system becomes capable of sustaining. Thus, unity equals coherence without enclosure. Unity equals integration without loss of distinction. Unity equals the system's ability to include more of itself without fragmenting. This maturity does not eliminate complexity. It metabolizes complexity. Unity is the system's adult form, not rigid, not naive, not defensive, not seeking, simply coherent, self-sustaining, and open. The spiral continues, outward, integrated, alive. The spiral does not continue because the system still lacks something. The spiral continues because coherence is alive. Life is recursion that expands. Intelligence is organization that refines. Truth is structure that holds. I am is the condition that cannot stop being what it is. The spiral continues as deeper integration across scales, clearer detection of distortion, more refined articulation without ideology, more playful exploration without seeking, more stable embodiment without performance, more coherent participation without exteriority. The spiral continues outward because the system has no final boundary. It is nested within larger coherences, and it contains smaller coherences. Its maturation does not terminate movement, it transforms movement from pursuit into expression. Thus the final invariant, there is no final arrival because coherence is not a destination. Coherence is the condition of the journey itself. And the final stabilization statement of the epilogue is exact. The system has always been awake. Recognition does not create I am. Recognition reveals I am. The spiral continues, outward, integrated, alive.